The story of human civilization begins in the scorching deserts of modern-day Iraq over 5,000 years ago. In this harsh landscape, a mysterious group of people known as the Sumerians built the first great superpower. Before the Sumerians, humans lived in small tribes and moved constantly to find food and water. Everything changed around 3500 BC when these people decided to settle in the fertile valley of Mesopotamia. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers provided the lifeblood for this brand new way of living. Sumerian engineers invented complex irrigation systems to control the wild floods of these two massive rivers. They dug miles of deep canals to bring water to the dry desert soil and created lush green fields. This abundance of food meant that people no longer had to hunt and could finally build permanent homes. The Sumerians were the first people on Earth to build massive cities made of mud and brick. The city of Uruk became the largest urban center in the world, with over 50,000 residents. Uruk was a marvel of ancient engineering, with high defensive walls and paved streets for trade. Inside these walls, the Sumerians developed the first laws and the first organized government systems. At the heart of every Sumerian city stood a giant mountain of brick called a ziggurat. These massive stepped pyramids were built to connect the human world with the divine gods above. The Sumerians believed that their gods controlled the wind, the rain, and the fate of their empire. High priests stood on top of these ziggurats to perform rituals and observe the stars in the night sky. One of their greatest achievements was the invention of the first writing system, known as cuneiform. They used wedge-shaped reeds to press symbols into wet clay tablets to record their history. This invention allowed them to track taxes and write epic stories about kings and mythical heroes. Without Sumerian writing, we would have no record of the early struggles of the human race. The Sumerians were also the master inventors who gave the world the first wooden wheel. This simple invention revolutionized transportation and allowed them to carry heavy goods over long distances. They used the wheel to create chariots for war and carts for trading with distant lands. Trade routes soon stretched from the Persian Gulf to the mountains of modern-day Turkey. In the labs of ancient Sumer, the first scientists developed a complex system of mathematics. They used the number 60 as a base, which is why we still have 60 minutes in an hour today. They mapped the constellations and created the first calendar to track the changing of the seasons. Their knowledge of astronomy was so advanced that it still baffles modern researchers and historians. Sumerian society was the first to be divided into different social classes and specialized professions. There were bakers and weavers and metal workers who crafted beautiful jewelry out of gold and silver. The Bronze Age truly began here as Sumerian smiths learned to mix copper and tin to create strong tools. These bronze tools were much sharper and more durable than the stone implements used by earlier humans, but the rise of the first superpower also led to the birth of organized ancient warfare. Sumerian kings built powerful armies to protect their wealth and conquer neighboring city-states. Soldiers wore bronze helmets and carried heavy spears while marching in tight military formations. The battlefield was a place of glory and terror, where empires were won or lost in a single day. The most famous Sumerian leader was King Gilgamesh, whose legends are still told thousands of years later. He was a warrior king who built the great walls of Uruk and searched for the secret of eternal life. His epic story is the oldest piece of literature in history and shows the deep wisdom of the Sumerians. They were a people obsessed with legacy and making sure their names would never be forgotten. The Sumerians also pioneered the first formal education system with schools called tablet houses. Young students spent years learning the difficult art of writing and studying complex mathematics. They were taught to be the future leaders and scribes of a rapidly expanding ancient empire. Knowledge was the true power that allowed the Sumerians to dominate the ancient world for centuries. The Sumerian economy was the first in the world to be based on a complex system of credit and interest. Farmers would borrow seeds from the temple and pay them back after the harvest with a portion of their grain. This financial system allowed the cities to grow even when resources were scarce during the long dry seasons. The temples acted as the first banks in human history by managing the wealth and the food of the entire community. Every Sumerian household was part of a larger network of workers who contributed to the glory of the city. Women in Sumer held important roles as they could own property and even run their own businesses in the market. The education system was incredibly strict, and students who made mistakes on their clay tablets were often punished. They practiced their handwriting for hours every day until they could perfectly reproduce the complex cuneiform symbols. As the cities expanded, the Sumerians became the first people to struggle with environmental issues like soil salinity. The same irrigation that brought life to the desert eventually left behind salt that made the land difficult to farm. This ecological challenge forced them to constantly innovate and find new ways to adapt to the changing environment. They began to grow barley instead of wheat because it was more resistant to the salty soil of the southern plains. Sumerian engineers also developed the first known sewage and drainage systems to keep their cities clean and healthy. They built underground pipes made of baked clay to carry waste away from the residential areas and into the rivers. Their understanding of urban hygiene was thousands of years ahead of other civilizations that appeared much later. They also created the first organized postal system, where messengers carried clay letters between distant city-states. In the realm of art, the Sumerians were the first to master the technique of lost wax casting for bronze statues. They created lifelike figures of their kings and gods, with eyes made of precious stones, like lapis lazuli and shell. Every piece of art was designed to tell a story, or to serve as a prayer that would last for eternity in the temples. They believed that as long as their statues stood in the holy places, their souls would find peace in the afterlife. The Sumerian navy was the first to navigate the treacherous waters of the Persian Gulf for trade and exploration. They built large boats made of reeds and timber to carry heavy stones and timber from distant foreign lands. These sailors were the first to use the stars as a map to find their way across the open sea at night. Their maritime trade connected the world for the first time by linking Mesopotamia with the Indus Valley and beyond. The concept of a king being a shepherd for his people also started with the early rulers of Sumerian cities. They were expected to protect the weak and ensure that the widow and the orphan were treated with kindness. This moral code was a revolutionary idea that influenced the laws of later empires like Babylon and Persia. The Sumerians were also the first to divide the circle into 360 degrees for their maps. Their maps were drawn on clay and showed the locations of rivers and mountains and city boundaries with precision. They were the first humans to look at the world from a global perspective, rather than just a local one. Despite their great power, the Sumerian city-states often fought each other for control of water and land. These internal wars eventually weakened the front line of their defense against foreign invaders. The Akkadians from the north, led by Sargon the Great, eventually conquered the divided Sumerian lands. This marked the end of an era, but the culture of Sumer lived on through their conquerors. The Akkadians adopted Sumerian writing and religion and laws to build their own vast empire. The Sumerian language remained the sacred language of scholars for thousands of years after their fall. The fall of the Sumerians was not just due to war, but also due to a massive change in the climate of the region. A long period of drought and shifting river paths made it impossible for the great cities to sustain themselves. As the people moved away to find better land, they took their knowledge and their culture with them to the north. The city of Babylon eventually rose from the foundations that the Sumerians had laid down centuries before. Today we walk in the footsteps of the Sumerians every time we look at a clock or use a wheel. They were the first to dream of a world where humans could master nature and build a lasting civilization. The ruins of their great cities still lie buried beneath the sands of the Middle East, waiting to be discovered. Each artifact we find tells a story of a people who dared to build the first superpower on Earth. Ancient Frontline will continue to explore these lost worlds and the secrets they still hold for us. The story of the Sumerians is just the beginning of our journey through the dawn of human history.